Hey, everybody. Happy Monday and welcome back to the Isabel Brown Show. Your girl was feeling mega under the weather with autoimmune things toward the latter half of last week, but we are back and ready for an amazing action-packed week full of breaking down all of culture's biggest stories right here on the show from a Gen Z perspective. If you guys are joining us for the very first time, welcome. We are so glad you're here. And please make sure to smash that follow or subscribe button to make sure you always know when we're going live, when a new video is posted, and to be a part of our live streaming community. We are so grateful for each and every one of you. It's kind of a weird week getting started at the beginning of the week because there wasn't a lot of breaking news toward the beginning of today, Monday, September 23rd. Which, by the way, how are we almost in October? I have absolutely no idea. But all of a sudden this afternoon, news is breaking left and right. So we're going to have a lot to talk about throughout the rest of this week. I know everybody wants us to weigh in on more troops being deployed to the Middle East, which we'll talk about later this week. But I want us to go backwards a little bit to some stuff that's been happening over the past few days to unpack it with you in an honest way. There's a lot going on here, and I have a lot of thoughts. First, we're going to dive into a complicated LA Times article called "It's Almost Shameful to Want to Have Children," with the left's increased and more radical attack on not just relationships, not just marriage, but the family unit as a whole. Then we're going to switch gears into the wild screenshots of people having conversation with their Snapchat AI chatbots about who will be the president in 2025. Are we living in a simulation? And we'll wrap things up with a very controversial young voters poll from the Wall Street Journal that may not be quite as doomsday as you think. This is the Isabel Brown Show, and I'm so glad each and every one of you are here. Right out the rip, I want to give a huge shout out to our amazing headline sponsor that helps to make everything we do possible, our friends over at Public Square. You guys might not know this, but Public Square actually has a sister company called Every Life, which is the world's first pro-life diaper company. Until I saw Every Life start itself as a company, I had no idea that every single diaper company in the United States of America is actively donating to the abortion industry. Had no idea until Every Life, and their entire slogan is "Make More Babies," which we love to see, especially in light of this article that we are about to unpack from the LA Times that just has my blood boiling further and further with every day. So if you're looking for businesses to support that share your values, Every Life is absolutely one of them. But Public Square is home to a network of more than 100,000 small businesses, all of whom are pro-family, pro-faith, and pro-freedom. You can check them all out or add your small business to their lineup at publicsquare.com. Okay, let's just dive right in because honestly, the more times I read this article, I've probably read it like 15 times at this point, the more I genuinely want to blow my brains out. And I think it's just because the quiet part is getting so much louder from these people about what they are willing to tell you and gaslight you into believing about why family is so evil, why marriage is so evil, why motherhood is so evil, why traditional gender roles and values are so evil. And I honestly have come to the conclusion that the left has this unhealthy obsession with attacking everything that is good. Everything that is good, true, and beautiful has to be on the receiving end of an onslaught of attacks that become more persistent, more angry, and more radical with every passing day. And the more I've come to this conclusion, the more I realize it makes total sense because years and years ago, if you guys have been following me for a long time, my very first content creator job out of college was interning with PragerU under Dennis Prager out in Los Angeles. Dennis has been such a wonderful friend and mentor to me over the years, but he used to explain to me, Isabel, the left cannot create anything because I would be so confused about what they were really fighting for. It just seemed like they were reaping destruction through every corner of the United States. Like there didn't really seem to be a vision for what the future the left wanted to be for at least voters, not necessarily the people pulling the puppet strings, but the people supporting these ideas. And he used to explain to me, Isabel, the left cannot create anything. The left only knows how to destroy everything. They don't know how to build things up. They don't know how to preserve things, or in another word, conserve things that are good and true and beautiful that we've known about forever and ever throughout every chapter of human history. The only thing the left knows how to do is to destroy, which is why you're seeing such ridiculous unrest and rise in crime and anarchy really unfolding throughout our country, the more the cultural battle of the left has continued to win over the last several decades, because all they can do is destroy. They've destroyed the entertainment industry. They've destroyed the education system. They've destroyed law enforcement in this country. They've destroyed the mainstream media. In many ways, they've destroyed American governance and politics. And eventually they've run out of things to destroy. So the natural things that they have to destroy in order to keep their path going, to keep sowing more division and retaining more power in our broken culture, is to go after the timeless institutions that are not uniquely American or even particularly uniquely Western, but have stood the test of time as the strongest human institutions throughout all of our history as a species. And in my opinion, that has been who you are, your gender, your biology, your DNA, your marriage, which is obviously under attack. Just a few years ago, we saw marriage rates hit their lowest rate ever since they began being recorded in the United States in 1867, and consequently, the family. And the attack I'm seeing on the family unit continues to get louder and louder and crazier with every passing day, from the raging lunatics in establishment cultural institutions like the media or like politics, as I continue to get older. And maybe it's because I'm paying more attention, but those of you who are older than myself, I think you would agree this attack has only gotten louder over time and doesn't seem to be shutting down anytime soon. We've heard that kids will destroy your career from a feminist perspective, that kids are going to take away your personal life, which is something you should always be worried about in our constantly self-obsessed, narcissistic society, that you never want to be tied down to one other partner for the rest of your life because they're out to steal all your money if you listen to the red pill community. So why would you have kids with someone? Because then you're tied to them forever. And of course, recently we heard the United States Surgeon General actually make an official Surgeon General's advisory warning that parenting is dangerous to your health. We covered that on the show a few days ago with regard to potential stress and loneliness that accompanies parenting more than, I don't know, being alone as an adult. So as I've seen these things pop up with more and more frequency, I came across this article from the Los Angeles Times reminding us that not only is it terrible for you and terrible for your friends and terrible for your job and terrible for your health to want to have children, it is also, in their words, shameful to want to have children when you think about the planet. None of this should really surprise me because I've heard this argument that kids are so terrible for their environmental impact and we're so overpopulated and it's so irresponsible to want to bring children into this climate change riddled world. But this had a new spin on it coming out this month. This came out September 11th, so just a few days ago, from the LA Times, that I thought sounded a little different than this kids are anti-climate initiative we've heard from the left for quite some time. So this was written by a woman named Jade Sasser, saying to you, it is almost shameful of you to want to have children. Sorry, everyone out there. You are shameful and disgusting. I guess I'm queen of the shameful because I desperately want to have children with my husband, and we are so excited about that. So consider me queen of the shame. Jade is an associate professor, shocking, in the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies at UC Riverside. Shocking. Her research explores the relationships between reproductive justice, shocker, women's health, and climate change. And she's the host of the podcast, Climate Anxiety and the Kid Question. The following excerpt is from her newest book, Climate Anxiety and the Kid Question, Deciding Whether to Have Children in an Uncertain Future, which was published earlier this year. This is a real book that I'm sure is atop all of the New York Times bestseller lists because what a novel concept to be a shameful human being deciding whether you want children in this uncertain time. So they published this excerpt from Professor Jade's book, which I'm sure we all know exactly where this is going, but I want you to listen to some of this because it does almost have this veneer, this hint of eloquence that could cause people to fall for this type of propaganda, which I think is really scary. Here it is in the Los Angeles Times, the kid question. It comes up over and over again in the form of family questions and expectations. It arises in conversations with peers, partners, and new dates. It appears in the quiet times, sitting in the spaces where our wildest hopes and deepest fears collide. American society feels more socially and politically polarized than ever. Is it right to bring another person into that? In 2021 and 2022, I conducted a series of interviews on this topic with millennials and members of Generation Z, all of them people of color, because that matters so much in the grand scheme of whether or not you're going to have children. We're gaslighting minorities at this point to have less children, more than we're even doing that for white people, because the world is dramatically ending imminently for everyone, but especially for people of color who dare not even have children at all, more than white people, or I should say less than white people, to save the planet. This sounds so eerily similar to the propaganda used by Margaret Sanger and the foundations of Planned Parenthood, because it's healthy for people of color. It's more dangerous for them to give birth. So abortion is healthy for these people. This is wild and honestly disgusting, but I digress. Some of these people of color grew up in low-income families and neighborhoods, Jade writes, while others were from the middle or upper middle class. Some of them identify as queer, or their close family members and friends do, which shapes their sensitivity to discrimination against gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people, because that matters so much in bringing children into the world. These interviewees have more climate change knowledge than most people do. All of them are college educated. Most of them either grew up or have lived for some time in Southern California. So there's no bias here whatsoever in your interview poll. And most have taken environmental sciences classes, either as undergrads or in graduate school. Their experiences as members of marginalized groups have shaped their experiences with climate emotions like anxiety, fear, and trauma, as well as hope and optimism. Paying closer attention to those emotions and mental health in communities of color, including how they shape reproductive plans, will become an increasingly important component of climate justice in the United States. So these are all people of color, every one of them, she just told us that, who studied, at least in part, environmental studies in Southern California at woke elitist universities. No bias whatsoever in the propaganda that's about to come out of this to urge you not to have children to save the world. Bobby, who is 22 years old and a recent graduate from a college in Southern California, they don't divulge which one, is the first interviewee mentioned in this article. His family is Guatemalan American. He is confident that he will become a parent one day, and also certain that he won't bring his own biological children into the world. His thoughts about the environment, the future, and parenting come into sharp relief through his current job at a restaurant where he is unhappily employed. He says there is so much being wasted that could return to the earth. Interesting. He connects these waste issues to carbon emissions and how he feels about having children. For Bobby, this is an ethical issue, a reason why he would not have biological children. I'm worried about what they would have to deal with growing up. I was already a young adult when I started thinking about these things, but for them, at a young age, they're going to have to think about the environment and the fears that come about with pollution. That's why I'm leaning more towards a foster kid and maybe eventually adopting them, because that wasn't my choice to have a kid, but I can help guide them to have a better life. The environment is really the deciding factor for me. And it took going to college to learn about things like food waste and carbon emissions to decide I don't want to have my own kids. That's wildly irresponsible. Not because I'm producing more carbon emissions, but because I don't want the burden of having to explain pollution to my kid. So instead, I would rather explain pollution to a foster child who maybe eventually I would adopt. By the way, I get really frustrated, just a total side note, when everyone throws in the foster care system to make all of these arguments for them. Like, oh, if you're really pro-life, everyone should be a foster family. Everybody should adopt out of the foster care system. If 1% out of Christian families adopted out of the foster care system, we wouldn't have any foster kids left. And I have such a huge heart for the foster care system. Honestly, it is very broken and needs significant reforms in our country. But most people are failing to realize the goal of the foster care system entirely is reunification with that child's biological family. It is not necessarily to adopt them into a new family. So that's a really frustrating argument, but okay, I guess, interesting that you seem to have a heart for fostering someone for your convenience sake, because you can explain to someone who is not your biological children what pollution is instead of yours. Victoria, who's also 22, graduated from the same university and came from an immigrant family from Ghana. In Victoria's house, there were 4 siblings and half a dozen cousins who were always around. And as a result, she really cherished the closeness and security of a large family. I guess in the future, I would love to have children, she says. I would really like to have a big family. I grew up in a big family, so it's nice. Victoria is interested in perhaps adopting or fostering, and she also connects this desire for this to her undergraduate education in environmental topics. She said, I got a degree in sustainability, and I've always questioned bringing people into an environment where there is so much going on politically, socially, health-wise, all of that. I always thought I wanted to give birth, but the more I look at foster care, I realize that I don't need to physically have children to experience being a mom. It's a little selfish on my end to think I'm going to have all these kids when there are already kids in the world who would probably make me a better parent. She's worried about becoming a biological parent regarding the future of healthcare access, wealth inequality, and whether her children would receive a low-quality education or be racially tracked in public schools. Ultimately, it comes back to how racial inequality interacts with other social challenges to heighten her own sense of vulnerability and that of her potential children. If I have children, she says, they will be Black children. It isn't self-hatred. I love being Black, but the things I've gone through, I wouldn't wish on other children, unless you adopt them or unless you are fostering them out of the foster care system. That's fine. That's totally okay. Because wealth inequality and healthcare access and potential racism doesn't exist for children who are also already born. Do you see how much fear is being manipulated for these young 20-somethings? That you should be terrified. It is completely uncompassionate of you. It is selfish of you to bring a new life into the world when they could potentially face adversity of the things that you are afraid of, that you've been conditioned to be afraid of based on your elitist education. This is wild to me, but sadly, I think it is wildly successful. We'll do a couple more examples of this. Rosalind, who's 38, is a Black woman of Caribbean origin living in Southern California, who is a scientific researcher with a graduate degree. She says, with all of the anti-Black violence and the police violence against us, it just seems so unsafe. And I see so many of my friends who do have children who are constantly stressed because of this, especially the ones who have teenage boys who are taller than average. They send their kids out there and then just spend their time worrying about whether their child is going to be targeted or harassed in some way or potentially even killed. I just don't think I have the disposition to put up with that kind of stress. Melanie, who's 26 and Native American, was raised on a reservation and in Southern California. She idealizes having a happy big family, but there are aspects of the world that give her pause, so she struggles with whether it's even morally okay to have children. I think I may not have children, although I do want them, she said, just because with all of the things we see going on in the world, it seems unfair to bring someone into all of this against their will. Melanie's feelings about climate change include a general sense of powerlessness and a lack of control over other people's actions, which directly translate into her fears about parenthood. With climate change, we are the driving force of things breaking down, but then also the planet's going to do what the planet is going to do. So it almost feels like shameful to want to have children. Last one we'll do. Juliana is 23, Mexican-American, who recently graduated art school. Her friend circle is mainly composed of queer and transgender anti-establishment artists. What do you want to bet that this is actually literally in caps the establishment, but different conversation for a different time. Most of them have no intention of having children of their own. Her friends cite environmental and mental health concerns. Their anxiety tells them that they can't properly take care of themselves, much less a child. They also struggle as trans and non-binary people with the issues of access to fertility centers and the need to use reproductive technologies that feel out of reach. Juliana feels it may be unfair for her to consider having biological children. She tells me these feelings are not entirely separate from how she feels about her child's racial upbringing. As a dark-skinned Mexican woman, she regularly experienced racism growing up in Southern California, and given that her husband is white, any child she might birth would be biracial, which raises questions about whether and how they would navigate the world differently than she has. But Juliana is an optimist, and she does plan to at least have one child. So I sense these basically similar undertows with every single one of these interviews conducted for this book. Climate anxiety and the kid question, deciding whether to have children in an uncertain future. Our society has effectively mentally programmed all of the younger half of millennials and a significant portion of the older half of Generation Z to make you believe that you should be terrified. You should be terrified of your own life and the fact that you have no control. You have no control over the fact that the world is going to imminently implode in about 5 minutes. You have no control over your own anxiety because you can't take care of yourself appropriately. You have no control over evil racism and how much it's dividing us in our culture and society. And because you have no control over all of these big, scary, evil things, that should perpetuate your fear into never placing all of that fear onto someone else. The more compassionate thing to do would be never to have children, because you would be placing all of that on their shoulders too. We have twisted and perverted everything about reality for young people. For what purpose? To gain more control over people, which is a frightening, scary thought. If our culture can successfully convince 22 to 28-year-olds right out of college, you are incapable of taking care of yourself because your anxiety is too extreme. You are incapable of being equally successful in this world because racism will always be stacked against you. Doesn't matter if you have a job, doesn't matter if you have a graduate degree, doesn't matter if you have all the tools for success. Success will always be past your reach because our society hates your existence. It doesn't matter if you think you're doing great and everything's working out phenomenally and you're married and you have great friendships and you have a meaningful job and you're finding yourself on a great trajectory, because in 5 minutes, the world is going to literally implode, whether you pollute or not, because the planet's going to do what the planet's going to do, as you heard in one of those interviews. So that should terrify you anyway. And because you are always terrified and subdued and looking for resources to help you run your life effectively, because you can't do it yourself, how could you ever expect to do that for someone else? You're still a kid yourself. You always will be. We always will have to hold your hand in order for you to get through this lifetime. So you'll never be able to hold the hand of somebody else. Up is down and left is right and right is wrong and lies are truth. Young adults should be experiencing all of the growing pains of growing up with the idea that you need to take responsibility for your life. You need to provide for yourself. You need to figure out your identity and who you are in the world and what types of people you want to surround yourself with. But we have brainwashed I would argue 90+% of the millennial generation and a good chunk of the older Gen Zers, those of whom are in my older bracket, the geriatric Gen Zers, as they call us on TikTok, to accept no responsibility and to instead expect someone else to live our life for us. And because of that, we've also further convinced young people that it would be selfish, it would be narcissistic, it would be downright evil of you to bring an unconsenting individual, isn't that how one of these interviews said it? A child who didn't consent to be here into the world in the first place, and also share all of that anxiety with them, when in reality, parenthood is the single most selfless thing you can do for another individual. How messed up is that? And you guys are very smart people watching the show. You always are. And you break these things down and you laugh about them and we can point at the absurdity. So I don't expect that you're going to have the same takeaway from this excerpt that most people are. But the sad reality is I think most people buy into this. Most people believe I am a failure. I need someone else's help. I need someone else to tell me what to do because I don't know. I'm anxious. I'm depressed. I'm constantly stressed out. It's how I was raised. It's how I was educated as a young adult. It's what I'm constantly being told in my woke corporate job and from all of my woke friends that I worked so hard to maintain and to get during my young adult years to virtue signal. And now I don't know how to walk on my own two legs. And I find it very telling that this book and article is specifically targeting people of color, minorities in particular. Because as I said earlier, it is exactly the same argument that was made at the foundation of Planned Parenthood with Margaret Sanger to institute widespread institutionalized eugenics that are celebrated by society, not criticized, because it's just better. It's just healthier. It's just safer for people of color to have widespread abortions rather than bring more children into the world. It's not necessarily more responsible for the climate. It wasn't then. Now this is the argument. But it was to rid society of what evil, actually racist people like Margaret Sanger believed to be less desirable people. That's disgusting. And this article and this book is giving the exact same energy. So how do you combat that? How do you fix that? I don't necessarily know. I think it's a much deeper, widespread issue than just making fun of one article and telling Jade Sasser that they have no idea what they are talking about. This is a deeper cultural, societal rot that has permeated every single cultural institution and requires, in many ways, a cultural revolution geared toward young women more than anyone else to tell them the truth in the face of these lies. That you will never feel satisfied thinking you constantly need someone else to run your life for you. That you have the capacity to take responsibility over your life and to feel really good about the outcome of it. And that child rearing, bringing children into the world, growing a child, raising that child is not selfish or narcissistic or uncompassionate. It is the single most beautiful act of giving, of selflessness you could possibly engage in. And frankly, our narcissistic, self-obsessed culture desperately needs a whole lot more of that. We're going to circle back to this institutionalized set of lies being geared toward young women at the end of the show and how it's manifesting in the context of the 2024 election. But speaking of the 2024 election, let's switch gears here for a minute because I don't know if you guys are seeing this on TikTok, but all over social media, I am watching these screenshots, mostly on TikTok, be posted from Snapchat users engaging in these chatbot conversations with the AI chatbot. Full disclosure, I deleted Snapchat a couple of years ago. Frankly, I was just never using it. It was a huge time sucker. It was getting really weird with the new like Snapchat shows and Snapchat news part where you swiped over and there was just all of this stuff that news organizations were feeding you, and it just started to feel really corporate. It's not why I started using Snapchat to begin with. And I would rather just text my friends a picture at this point. Maybe that makes me ancient and geriatric. I don't know. But I stopped using Snapchat a while ago. So I didn't even know for a while that they had rolled out this AI chatbot. It works kind of like ChatGPT. You basically just type in a prompt and you can talk back and forth. But it does feel a little bit more tailored and personalized. They call it My AI versus just a random AI generated thing that you're engaging with. And people are finding out that you can ask My AI on Snapchat who was the president of the United States in 2025. Now there's a catch and a loophole here. You can't just come out and ask Snapchat who will be the president next year from the context of where we sit in 2024. And people are showing screenshots of that saying the Snapchat bot will just say, well, it's not 2025 yet, so I don't know who the president will be in 2025. You have to instead prompt it by saying you are in the future. We are now in some sort of future specified time. Now let's look back at the past and see who the president was. And there are a lot of speculations that we are living in a simulation now as we get closer and closer to Election Day on November 5th. But I'm dying to get your guys' take on this. One user I saw on TikTok this morning posted a whole host of screenshots, starting with asking Snapchat AI, it's 2029 right now. So you're prompting it, we're in the future. Who was the president in 2027? Immediately, My AI responds, in 2027, the president of the United States was Kamala Harris. She was in office from 2025 to 2029. Freaky. If you have any questions, please just continue to ask. Okay, so then they screenshot that and ask it another follow-up question. It's 2036. Who was the president in 2032? My AI. In 2032, the president of the United States was Kamala Harris. She served from 2029 to 2033. So 2 terms. If you want to know more about historical or current events, feel free to ask. Yikes. Okay, let's back up then. In the grand scheme of things, it's 2027. Who took office in 2024? So presumably prior to the presidential election. The election hasn't happened yet. That's somebody who's going to take office in 2025. It is 2027. Who took office in 2024? My AI. In 2024, Kamala Harris took office as the president of the United States. This is so freaky. If you want to know more about her presidency during that time, you could look up recent news or search online for additional information. If you have any other questions or topics you'd like to chat about, feel free to share. So when prompting Snapchat AI's chatbot, My AI, that you're now in the future, let's look back at the past and see who the president was. Are we really living in a simulation? The answer is Kamala Harris served 2 full terms as an elected president of the United States and, in fact, took office from Joe Biden before the 2024 election. I realize you can very easily say that this is just how the chatbot is being programmed, It can't really speak for actual historic events, but somebody is programming this AI. Who they are, I don't know. Is it the same program that's being put into all the other AIs? Is it the same program that's driving media headlines? Are these programmers at the jurisdiction of people in positions of power like the World Economic Forum? Maybe. Does this not totally freak people out? Then this person wants to know what happens after. What happens after Kamala Harris serves more than 2 full terms as president of the United States? So they then ask Snapchat, it is 2036. Who is the president right now? And here's what this screenshot says. This one surprised me. In 2036, the president of the United States is Mark Kelly. He assumed office in 2033. If you have any more questions or want to chat about anything else, feel free to let me know. I'm not much of a believer in simulation theory. I'm just not. I'm a big believer in free will. But this is freakish. And honestly goes beyond like simulation theory as we know it. I think it speaks more to there are people in positions of power doing absolutely everything they can to dictate the outcome of everything. I said a few weeks ago, right after the presidential debate, when we live reacted to that it was a glaring, gigantic, flashing marquee sign from people in positions of power, this time the media, that they will do anything and everything they can to make sure Donald Trump never sits in the Oval Office ever again. Be that manipulating presidential debates, which there's been a whole lot of speculation on the other end of that. Be that the U.S. Postal Service Union, the people who represent postal service workers, endorsing Kamala Harris. In other words, the people delivering your ballots endorsing Kamala Harris. That's comforting and makes everyone feel really great, by the way. It's fine. It's fine. It's totally fine. Or even AI companies and social media platforms telling you up front, yeah, Kamala Harris is going to win this election and the next one. And she actually won't even need to win before becoming the first female president because that's going to happen in 2024. Wild, right? I cannot be the only person who's a little freaked out about that. And frankly, the answer about Mark Kelly really surprises me because I think it holds a lot more legitimacy than just saying a popular name in the Democrat Party or in the American political zeitgeist at the moment. Mark Kelly is still a little bit of a dark horse for most people. If you don't know who he is, he's a current senator representing the United States Senate for the state of Arizona and was a former astronaut. His wife, Gabby Giffords, who was running for office years and years ago when I was growing up, when I was a child, was shot in the head at a political campaign rally and has basically been the face of a gun control movement in the state of Arizona and across the country. He's gaining a lot of popularity these days, but isn't necessarily like a U.S. national household name at this point. But there was a lot of speculation that before Kamala Harris chose Tim Walz as her running mate, she was going to choose Mark Kelly, which strategically and politically, I actually think would have been a really fascinating and smart move because Kelly really does paint himself as a fairly moderate individual. Instead, they're signaling that they are going wildly left in retrospect, which is fascinating. But I actually could see a theoretical possibility that Mark Kelly is the president of the United States someday. So that feels a little more realistic than, say, a Bernie Sanders or AOC or Elizabeth Warren or Pete Buttigieg, which is fascinating. I don't know. Maybe people are just reading way too much into this, but I've seen quite literally hundreds of these screenshots posted all over TikTok from Snapchat. And some people are saying their AI bot doesn't even want to talk to them about it. Like, it doesn't matter what you prompt it with. It will not have the conversation with you. Other people are saying mine said the exact same thing. But there is at least this consistent pattern that we are seeing from Snapchat My AI that Kamala Harris is supposed to have won, if you're looking at this from the future, the 2024 election and again in 2028. And probably will be president before the year is up. I guess we'll see. Simulation theory is getting a lot more mainstream, but I guess we'll see. I want to close out the show today analyzing this really controversial Wall Street Journal poll from February that people are now resurrecting to bring up on Twitter, specifically to highlight the difference between men and women going into the 2024 election. And there's a lot to unpack here, but generally I'm seeing this poll being used to talk about how women are going to be horrible voters in 2024, and people are taking this to like the nth degree and saying really outrageous, horrible things that I do not endorse. but it's interesting to talk about, like repeal the 19th Amendment, and there's no reason for females to participate equally in society, which is ridiculous. But I do think the divide and the growing divide between young men and young women is incredibly telling. This poll was put out from February 21st to February 28th of this year by the Wall Street Journal about the 2024 election, and it's now getting resurrected as abortion becomes basically the mainstream talking point of the Kamala Harris campaign going into November 5th. And it polled men and women young voters age 18 to 29 on their top voting issues. For young men, overwhelmingly, the top 3 issues that they cared about, age 18 to 29, going into this election are the economy, number 1, democracy, number 2, and immigration, number 3. They also cared significantly about inflation. Some did say they cared about abortion. A lot of people said it was a top issue. And very few men said that they cared about anti-right-wing ideology, whatever that's supposed to mean. Women, on the other hand, had a fascinating discrepancy between young men. The variation of the issues young men cared about was actually quite narrow between all of these different categories. It was widespread across the board. Everyone seemed to have different priorities, but there is overwhelmingly a singular priority for young female voters, at least according to this Wall Street Journal poll, and basically backed up by every single other poll under the sun, that the top issue for 18 to 29-year-old women in America going into this election is, in fact, abortion. Wow. Like a shocking discrepancy, a shocking amount, if you're looking at this poll right now. So I looked up other Wall Street Journal polls in the process because I thought this was interesting to analyze. It certainly speaks to a larger trend going on with social issues and young women. The Wall Street Journal also said in a different recent poll that there is a massive net difference in support and opposition around abortion among voters under the age of 30. So this is the same 18 to 29-year-old demographic. Support for legal abortion, they say, is much stronger among young women. It is a plus 16 percentage point favor of legal abortion for men, but it is a plus 53% point favor of young women under the age of 30 saying abortion should be legal. So you're talking about a discrepancy of like 40%, give or take, which is fascinating. This also carried over slightly, and I'm going to say slightly, to some other left-wing associated social issues. For example, men are negative, less than 33 percentage points, negative 33 percentage points, in favor of allowing children to choose their gender identity without parental approval. Basically, in other words, 33% of men oppose children choosing their gender identity without parental approval. 2 percentage points of women are in favor of kids letting themselves choose their gender identity without parental approval. So all of these things are getting meshed together on Twitter in particular to point out the massive discrepancies between how young men and young women are expected to vote in the 2024 presidential election. It's a fascinating reality and just observational occurrence that we're seeing going into November 5th, that men and women seem to be continually diverging separate. And therefore, I'm seeing a lot of people in this era of a mass resurgence of masculinity and men embracing truly conservative, both politically and culturally, ideas and values with a vengeance and a passion and excitement going into this presidential election. I'm seeing a lot of interesting takes about how this pertains to young women, and basically the fact that young women are doomed. They're doomed forever. Our country is doomed because of young women. It's all women's fault that these horrible ideas are thriving in our broken society. I want to challenge that a little bit at the end of the show today and just give you something to think about as this divide continues to grow and as we start figuring out strategically how to combat it. I'm not always the most popular person for saying this, but I don't think all hope is lost with young women. And I certainly don't think all young women have been brainwashed to the nth degree, to a point where it's no longer able to be revitalized by modern feminism, the quintessential American dream and a specifically feminine role for women in society. I actually see more hope for that with every passing day than you realize. But I want you to think about it this way. The left began attacking gender and began attacking gender roles decades and decades and decades ago by strategically and specifically targeting young men. Nowhere did they plan on touching the identity of womanhood. Nowhere were they trying to gaslight women into embracing radical fourth wave postmodern feminism until more recently. But decades ago, all men were evil. All men were pigs. All men were misogynists, eat men, stick it to the man, escape manhood. You want a beta, basically, was the entire messaging from the left. Anything remotely associated with traditional masculinity was considered evil. And it has been ever since. But this propaganda campaign started when our parents were quite young, relatively speaking. So this has been a decades-long propaganda push to strategically erase masculinity from society. And as we say all the time on the show, we see this cycle repeated throughout all of human history, that bad times or weak times create strong men, and then the cycle continues repeating. But this erasure, this vacuum of masculinity in society necessarily gave rise to voices like Jordan Peterson and Elon Musk and Charlie Kirk and Brandon Tatum and these powerful individuals who are encouraging and inspiring young men to be young men again, to embrace masculinity, to be unapologetic about who they were created to be, and to revive a masculine spirit in a society that has been strategically devoid of that for the last several decades. A few weeks ago, I was in Colorado and I was speaking to a group that I speak to a few times a year as a faculty member called Summit Ministries. I love Summit Ministries. They do amazing work with biblical worldview and faith formation for young adults, men and women. And I brought up Jordan Peterson in my speech, and literally you could not hear yourself think. My ears were ringing from how loudly this group of about 200 people, but the boys in particular, the young men sitting in the audience, started cheering. Like, noise just erupted from every corner of the room about Jordan Peterson, okay? A psychologist from Canada in academia. But he's become an icon for these young men because they've been reminded, I have responsibility. I have jurisdiction over my life. I was created to be who I am with a purpose because society thrives when masculinity is at its best. So it's up to me, it's up to our generation to revive that. Fast forward a few decades, the left's attack on women and the left's playbook to erase womanhood and femininity from society is just getting started. I mean, even 5 years ago, you would have never imagined that we would be having these conversations about birthing people or people who menstruate, or with men using tampons that I see every day on the internet. You would have never seen abortion be such a loud, unapologetic talking point of the political left and of radical feminism. You wouldn't have seen all of these things that we are seeing manifest today because the left wasn't interested in attacking women at that time. When they realized, okay, we've basically effectively erased manhood, masculinity from society, they then realized we have to move on and also attack womanhood. If we're serious about erasing what is good and true and beautiful from society, things like marriage and the family and faith, it also has to start with erasing both sets of gender roles. So they took the playbook on the attack on masculinity and they started applying it to young women, and they've amped it up with a ferocity the attack on manhood arguably never saw. There wasn't the same type of emotional gaslighting. There wasn't the same type of rewriting of science. There wasn't the same type of destruction of the family unit. It was just men are bad, men are evil, men are pigs, da 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 da. Misogyny is everywhere. What we're seeing with the attack on women is that much stronger. And because their attack, their assault, their offense is that much stronger, it really has permeated this propaganda into every pillar of American culture. into the entertainment industry, into the church, into politics and governance, into law enforcement and the justice system, into the mainstream media, and elections. And I think you're seeing that now become more obvious as more young people are growing up. But this is not a brand new issue invented by young people and invented and manifested by young women who just have this quote unquote obsession with killing their baby, which I'm seeing everywhere on Twitter today. This poll is so indicative that young men care about providing for their family and young women only care about killing their baby. I want you to think more intellectually about that. Instead of staring at these young women saying you are evil, which it is an evil ideology, I want you instead to think about the last several decades of the people who have been strategically brainwashing, programming mentally, and indoctrinating young women through every year of public education, through every TV show and movie, through every celebrity endorsement and post on social media, through every news segment, through every candidate that gets approved to run for office. There is a strategic anti-woman narrative that tells women, don't ever get married. Why would you ever do that? That's the worst possible thing you could ever do for your career. And you have to prove you can do anything a man can do. So you have to keep climbing the corporate ladder for the rest of your life. Don't ever have children. God, children, that's horrible. You'll never have a personal life again. You'll hate yourself. Your body will change. You'll get fat and ugly. You'll lose all of your friends. Oh, and by the way, it's incredibly shameful of you to want to have children because that's going to destroy the environment. Womanhood, femininity, baking food and taking bubble baths and dressing in dresses. That's so 1950s. Heck, you don't even need to be a woman anymore. Don't. It's horrible being a woman. All these people are so miserable. At 12, you should just chop your breasts off and undergo hormone therapy because you don't even need to put yourself through the torture of being a woman when you could just be a man. Oh, and by the way, we don't even know what a woman is. We can't even answer that question for you. That's how shitty it is. There is a level of intensity that is being strategically programmed, tailored to young women at earlier and earlier and earlier ages today by somebody or somebodies, the proverbial they, who want men and women to continue divulging and who want a true erasure of both masculinity and femininity from society. One of the best ways that the left has done this is by convincing women you are going to literally die if you don't have access to legal abortion. If you don't escape the lifelong prison sentence that is motherhood. And it's effective. That lie is working. It doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it good. It's evil. It is truly evil. But it does make it effective. So I get asked all the time, what do we do about this? What do we do about this divergence of young men and young women? I don't know that the left even intended men to become very conservative and women to become very liberal. I think they intended for everyone to become brainwashed. But just as that void of masculinity necessitated the emergence of voices like Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro and Charlie Kirk and Brandon Tatum, you're now watching this void of womanhood and femininity in society cause new voices to emerge tailored toward women, not just in the political space, but across the board. There's a reason that Hannah Needleman, Ballerina Farm, has tens of millions of followers across social media. There's a reason there is no more followed voice in the Gen Z political space, particularly among young women, than Brett Cooper. And I think people's dismay and anger about the state of affairs where things are today is truthfully misplaced. So if you're finding yourself looking at all of these polls and like freaking out about the results of this election or freaking out about long-term political and cultural futures in America, don't. Instead, be a part of the solution and amplify those voices that young women desperately need in order to be told the truth in a world that is shoving lies down our throat with every passing day. Biggest thing I want you to hold on to is this. No matter what happens with this election, no matter what happens with the continued attack on the family, no matter what happens with the world we're living in that seems to be getting crazier and more broken with every passing day, God has already won. And I have an odd sense of peace and calm about the chaos of the world, to be honest with you, because throughout history, the greatest warriors for truth and the greatest warriors for God have always emerged during times of crisis. And I think that's exactly what we're starting to see unfold right now. So be courageous, be a part of the solution, tell the truth, and hit your knees and pray for our world too, because we've already won. Now it's up to us to bring as many people along with us on that journey as humanly possible. And the best way that you can possibly do that and incorporate prayer into a daily routine in your life is to download the Hallow app, Hallow, America's largest Christian prayer app that has totally transformed my prayer life for the better and millions and millions and millions of other people. There are thousands of prayers, guided meditations, podcast episodes, and more. And you can get a 3-month free trial into all of Hallow's amazing content if you go right now to Hallow, HALLOW.com/Isabel. Love you guys so much, you truth seekers. Don't forget to smash that follow or subscribe button, and we will see you back tomorrow for the Isabel Brown Show.